In the not-too-distant future, a revolution is brewing, one that will change the very fabric of our existence. It's a tale of cells that hold the key to unlocking the mysteries of life itself. Let us venture into the unknown, for in this age of stem cells, anything is possible.
I've seen some beautiful...
Hi, Jan. We're back.
We're back. Short break, but couldn't get rid of us that easily.
So for those that don't know, we have full-time jobs. We're not podcast stars. And so we are trying to squeeze these podcasts in the midst of whatever is going on. And so last month was a crazy month. So we weren't able to film. So we apologize for missing an episode. But quick things on what we accomplished. We hosted our first gala, fundraising gala for the foundation. And we raised $1 million.
Yes, we raised over $1 million in the company of more than 400 incredibly supportive community members. And that doesn't include the more behind the scenes who helped make the event possible. It was a night to remember, for sure.
It was.
Yeah.
And a highlight, if I must say, your daughter, Kaylin, and my daughter, Grace, was present. Yes. And you are wearing the Hope necklace that we gave out that night.
I am. I treasure it, as does everyone else who picked up that necklace night of. And if you didn't, I think we can put a picture up, right?
There's that awesome photo of Kaylin putting the necklace on Grace that was captured.
It was a moment. It was really, really awesome. And that was the theme of the night, I think. Just all these unexpected, deeply human moments that were really incredible.
And the impact that, and we talked about a little bit about what we think this is going to mean for the next generation and how young people are getting excited about it. And we honored some young people that night. So that was great. And on the other front, I took a whirlwind trip to Korea to present our findings, our top-line results for multiple sclerosis. Yes. The foundation completed a 24-patient study, placebo-controlled study in MS, and it was an incredible success. So glad to share that. And then the Friday before, actually, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk about this because we haven't officially announced it, but the Friday before the gala, we got authorization. So until it's announced, I'm just going to speak in acronyms for GIA. So it's super exciting. And then, and so we've just had a boatload of things going on, which is why we are delayed. But that's a long explanation as to why we're delayed. Yes.
Hey, but updates like that are worth waiting for, I think. There's really great stuff happening.
So Jan and I have been talking about what are the best topics to discuss in Stem Cell Revolution. And it's fitting that we've just come through this election season. And that is another thing that happened through all of this, right? Well, our country went through a massive shift. Kind of feels like a revolution, right, in a way. And so I got a ton of texts after a specific tweet. I don't know. Is it called a tweet? Ever since it's X, what do we
call it? Is it?
You call it an X? Okay. Well, whatever it's called, a tweet, an X. And what is that? Can you read it?
So I have it. So this is from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's rapidly becoming a hashtag on said platform. And he wrote, FDA's war on public health is about to end. This includes its aggressive suppression of, and then he lists a number of things, including stem cells.
So I get all these texts from people saying, oh my gosh, is this going to change your world? Are you going to be impacted by this? And all of that. And I thought, for a long time, we've wanted to sit down and talk about the legality of stem cells because it's one of the most common questions we get. are stem cells legal? Well, they're illegal. So why are you doing what you're doing? How are you treating people here in the United States if they're illegal? And so it's a loaded question. The question itself is sort of phrased incorrectly. So in order to get to the answer, we kind of have to work our way backwards and parse out the legality of, first, there's difference between legality of stem cells in research, in the context of research. And then there's also the difference or the legality in treatment or usage of stem cells. So those are two buckets. So I thought today it'd be good to kind of just summarize the two so that we're all on the same page. Because if, like what RFK Jr. said, if we are in an era where we are going to be taking back our health or having more control over our health, I think it's important that we know what the issues are and we know how to talk about them, right? Yeah, so we can maybe spur some change. So, all right.
I like it.
So let's start with research.
Yes. So, you'd mentioned two buckets. We're going to start by talking about research. Cell therapy is not something they were studying, centuries ago. So talk to me more about when this advent of cell therapy research began. And what I'm seeing in my notes here, the National Research Act was established in 1974 to create the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, which included, under that umbrella, emerging stem cell studies. So very quickly, early in the research landscape, there was a link between the work that's being done and the people it should be serving. So talk to me about all that. How did this research environment come to be?
Well, so that suggests that before 1974, there was a lack of regulation in the protection of human subjects. There have been since many issues and scandals that we know of, but I think at this time they foresaw the use of cellular treatments. They didn't really know what that would look like, but they established some framework for the protection of humans at that time. And those regulations are largely what we still follow today in clinical research, so in research involving humans. Yeah. But the major stem cell related research regulations showed up in 1995.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and if you can talk a little bit in greater detail there, I think the conversation immediately shifts today to embryonic research and adult cell therapy research. We get asked that question a lot. Do we do embryonic research here? We do not, But as early as 1995, we see the Dickey-Wicker Amendment introduced, which talks about where funding for research comes from and types of research like embryonic.
Well, adult stem cell research was sort of an afterthought. Early stem cell research really started with embryonic stem cell research because at that time we didn't know stem cells could come anywhere else other than from an embryo. And the definition of stem cells, like a pluripotent stem cell, and again, definition of a stem cell is a cell that can differentiate or transform into different tissue types. And since an embryonic stem cell could become an entire human being, it meant that every cell that makes up an embryo is going to become every tissue of the body. So that means by definition, it is pluripotent, or actually totipotent. It's able to do all things. So from that time in 1995, when they said, okay, well, we're not going to allow any kind of embryonic stem cell research, at least to where human embryos were destroyed. It actually just meant that they were prohibiting federal funding. I think people get caught up with this idea that, well, our government is regulating what we can and cannot research, but it was more, well, we're going to restrict funding. And yes, we all know that if you restrict funding, you're essentially restricting access to this type of research. But all in all, there there haven't been any regulations that just prohibit any kind of research from happening.
Well, and then if we move into the 2000s, then President Bush, continued to restrict federal funding. And then as recently as 2009, though you see a bit of a reversal under then President Obama, the NIH was authorized to develop guidelines to allow more funding, right? So we have this kind of going back and forth on what we're going to fund for embryonic research, but you don't see adult cell therapy research like the kind we conduct here in the legislative headlines during that time period. So what was going on this 1990s, 2000s that pertains more specifically to adult cell therapy research?
So in the early 2000s, when President Bush said, we're going to restrict federal funding for embryonic stem cell research, everyone bucketed that into stem cell research. There wasn't ever a dividing line. So you're talking about a dividing line here between embryonic and adult. I like to think that the official restriction of federal funding in the early 2000s spurred another generation of stem cell research. So now researchers are saying, well, we're not getting federal funding for embryonic stem cell research. We got to find other sources for stem cells, and could there be? And that really enabled us to make some important discoveries in the early 2000s in relation to adult stem cells. So now we can find actually like multipotent, even in some ways pluripotent stem cells from adult tissues. So without ever touching an embryo, we can actually find these same sort of powerful cells. So that was an important achievement. And so today we're going to just wrap up the research end. Important for everyone to know, all research is happening, both on the embryonic side, on the adult side. Projects are being funded across all different types of cell usage, or cell type, and NIH is funding protocols across the board too, and they are reviewing and regulating protocols to ensure that proper ethical and safety standards are maintained.
So we're talking about legislation pertaining to research throughout the 1990s, bringing us into the 2000s. The same thing is happening on what I like to think of as the people side, right, which is access to cell therapy, which is treatment. So on the people side, in 1993, we see the FDA establish the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And they oversee biological products, including cells and tissues, as biotechnologies really start to emerge at an increasingly rapid rate.
It's so hard to believe that CBER didn't exist prior to 1993. Yeah. It's just crazy. So from a drug regulation standpoint, right, every drug that is regulated in the United States is regulated by FDA, and it's regulated under CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation. So suddenly they realize that, well, we're going to say that living cells, are going to be bucketed into drugs. But clearly there's a difference between a pill, like a pill of Tylenol, which we always use as an example, versus a biological living product. But that is not established until 1993, and it's only 30 years ago. So it's all within our lifetimes, at least, right? And all rather recent conversation. And so the bottom line is we're all new at this. We're all sort of navigating this space together, regulators and industry alike. Okay.
Well, and to date ourselves even a little more, the next date on my notes here is that in 1997, which, I remember what kind of music I was listening to in 1997, right? The FDA issues an early draft of regulatory guidelines, fall under the heading Human Cells, Tissues, and Cellular and Tissue-Based Products. And those talk about, implantation, transportation, infusion, transfer, all the kind of methodologies that we use to introduce cell therapy into a real person sitting in a real chair receiving this technology.
But at the same time, it wasn't really cell therapy, at least not as how it's defined today. So it gets very complicated. And I think we'll save the conversation for like how FDA came up with the definition or what the definition means for an HCTP, a human cell tissue product, versus a drug product, a biologic. They are regulated under two different sections within the Public Health Safety Act. So you've got a 351, which is a biological product. That is an equivalent to a drug product, but that's a biological in nature. And then 361, which is just a human cell tissue product, which largely the dividing line is sort of products that you are already in you, okay, that you can just put back in. So let's say things like organs. Like you're transferring one organ from one person to another would fall under the HCTP regulation. And everything else that involves more processing, okay, goes into CBER. So now CBER oversees anything that falls into the actual drug biologic framework. So,
yeah. I agree with you. I think that's a conversation for a next time because it's more in depth, but it is such a great one. And it's so hard not to dive right into it because questions around what constitutes, a natural product, what constitutes manipulation of a product, drive the way that cell therapies are researched in this country in very meaningful ways. And we get asked that a lot. So looking forward to having that conversation later. All right, so we've moved out of the 90s, which may or may not be a good thing for music.
I think Britney Spears is coming up here, right? Are we?
I don't want to know what she said.
Yet?
I don't know what she said on Twitter lately. That's probably. And we see in 2001, the FDA adopts the 21-part 1271 regulations. Okay. And this is the framework that we, continue to refer to that really regulates human cells and tissues. It distinguishes between the types that you mentioned before, 361s and 351s. And again, here we kind of get into manipulation, but the important part, we're going to gloss over this for now. We'll go in the details at a later date. The important part is that in 2005, we see the Part 1271 regulations come into full effect. And what this means is it creates official requirements for clinical trials and the path to FDA approval through FDA authorized research for certain cell therapy products.
So this time between the late 90s and early 2000s, they say it was the gray zone where it was people, doctors, practitioners in their own offices were doing all kinds of stuff. And it was essentially just the wild, wild west of stem cells. And sometimes people will get confused saying that, well, it was legal back then and now it's not. And it wasn't so much. So you have to step back and kind of look at the early advances in stem cells. So all these discoveries are happening, right? People are finding out that, our bodies contain these stem cells, and some of them are in our blood, and some of them are in our tissues. Like fat tissue was a big discovery in the 90s. And so these discoveries are spurring innovation on the local level, right? Sort of on the grassroots level. You have doctors saying, well, shoot, I can find stem cells from blood and they're starting to give these treatments to their patients without really understanding what it was that they were giving. So FDA then says, well, we need some ground rules, because if we say, we're going to regulate stem cells that are processed, well, then what are the rules for processing? And so that's why you see this gap between the time where they put their foot down and the time that they actually give regulations. So until they could put regulations on a piece of paper, yes, it was largely a a free-for-all, if you will, right? People doing all kinds of things.
It was. And I think in many ways, I mean, the sector, the industry is still regaining balance from that free-for-all period, because there's a certain things were not always done that were in the patient's best interest, right? And you saw these kind of, I'm trying to think of a better word than shady, and I can't think of one, right? People trying things for the sake of trying them as opposed to having a plan, having a vision, and truly evaluating the technology. So that's why conversations like this, I think, are so incredibly important. People sitting in chairs making healthcare decisions need to know the history of what they can come across if they start Googling cell therapy. Where did it come from? What's the context? What does it mean? So they can evaluate it for themselves.
I mean, all the things that we see, and yes, there are clearly very shady, infomercial type stem cell stuff that one should obviously stay away from. But when you have a trusted doctor who has good intent, who has just read that some tissue in your body is a great source of stem cells, and decides that, well, if we take some of these, we isolate some of this and give it back to you, well, clearly it's from your own body, so it's safe. So I feel comfortable giving this back to you, and it may very well be safe. The problem and the reason why you need to have this sort of regulation is because the doctor might have great intentions, but they too do not know what is present in that tissue, right? They are too not aware of exactly how many cells are in there. And if we're going to treat this like a medicine, then medicine has specific dosage, a specific treatment schedule, things like this, that you can advise a patient on what the efficacy will be if you take this treatment in this way. But in cell therapy, those ground rules, in order for those instructions to be created, you have to do the clinical work to prove that these are the appropriate instructions. And so without that, you have doctors, again, with very good intentions, may not be aware that possibly what they're giving back doesn't have many cells to begin with, and could maybe give a benefit, but maybe it's not a very long-term benefit, not enough for what you're going to be charging the patient or what the patient will be going through. So a lot of factors to consider there, which is why there need to be rules, definitely. There needs to be some level of regulation, and there's a reason for that. Yeah.
Well, and maybe only tangentially related, but as I was listening to you, I kept thinking, I had an art teacher in high school in one of those, 1990s years, I'm not going to say which one, who used to tell me that human beings are inherently creative, and they believed that really any human could create something beautiful once. But it took a true technician, it took a true master to be able to replicate something, to know what was going to happen, to be able to predict what was going to happen, to understand all the components to create the desired result. And to me, that is what good research does, is it answers questions about efficacy, about periodicity, about how the technology works in people, in a variety of people, in a consistent way with a good technology, right? Which is perfect. That's what we want. That's what we're here for. Yeah. So now we've moved through 2005 into Part 1271 regulations. FDA has kind of put their arms around how they want to think about cell therapy and how they want to regulate it, whether right or wrong. They've made some decisions there. And now they start clarifying and enforcing their regulations. About 2008, we start to see that. In 2010, we see the FDA pursue a lawsuit against Regenerative Sciences LLC for actively marketing to people. And I want to pause here for a minute because I think it's important that we remember when we're marketing a therapeutic or a healing solution, right? Who are we talking to? We're talking to people who are in need, which means they're sick, which means they may be feeling desperate, they may be lonely, they may be isolated, depending on how far along they are in their health journey. People in need like that make dramatic decisions, and sometimes they make them quickly, which is one of the reasons why marketing, like, it's one thing to go, oh, well, they're marketing, what's the big deal there? But this is marketing to extremely vulnerable people in a time of dire need. So talk to me about that. What are your thoughts?
Preying on those that are most vulnerable, that is, I'm glad we have laws in place to protect them. At the same time, laws should not inhibit those vulnerable patients to also have access to things that they desperately need or could benefit from. Again, it's not proven yet, but that they could. I think the right to try regulation that came up in 2019 for our country is it was a clear solution to this problem, right? And there are, of course, not enough, there are no real defined regulations in the right to try. I mean, there are good parameters that both a manufacturer has to have and a patient has to have in order to be qualified for these kinds of treatments. But I don't know how many people are taking advantage or how many companies are making their products available. I hope that many good manufacturers are making their products available. I think it's an avenue for those vulnerable patients to get their hands on something that might help and that is manufactured in a safe way. So that is that has at least, hopefully, given the patients at least more options so that they can go that route as opposed to taking high risk with something that is, someone selling on the street or even someone selling in a foreign country. We see that all the time. People are getting on planes and going to foreign countries to get these, praying for miracles, and nobody knows really what is being given back, right? That's a huge risk. That's not just a safety risk. There's a huge financial risk there too. Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about right to try? As a drug manufacturer, mm-hmm. right? What is the program and why do you see value in being involved in it? How does it add value?
Yeah, I think for a long time, and we've talked about this before, for a long time, do we make our products available under the Right to Try Act? And for a long time, we said no. No, we have to make it available only in the context of a clinical trial. That way we can collect the data. And so at some point, those decisions started to feel more selfish, more protection of the company, because, okay, if we are going to only do this within the context of a trial, then how about the people who would never qualify for a trial? And who those people are. They're largely, they're too old to participate. They have so many other conditions that would preclude them from participating. And so for those types of people, and also high-risk individuals, okay, so by definition, if they have a life-threatening condition, then that's a very bad situation. And you would never want to put someone like that in a trial, because if, God forbid, something happened, it could impact your entire study. It could impact everybody having access to your product, right? So you can understand why drug companies are overly cautious when it comes to joining a program like that. But for us, it was really a decision based on we're not, and I think it took a few individual cases where it was like, wow, this person would really be a good fit for Right to Try. It really was that, Yeah. And once you came across those certain individuals, it was a no-brainer.
The question we get asked in a very informal way quite often is, why are stem cells illegal? So talk to me about that. Is that the right question?
Yeah, so obviously, depending on what the program is, so there are avenues for people to access stem cells. So it's not that stem cells blanketed are illegal. Okay, now we've gone through the research. Research is not illegal. There are funding restrictions, but it is legal. Stem cell treatment is also legal, but under certain parameters. So if you hear that, people can't receive cells in the United States, that's not true. We are a clear example of that, where access is being granted on a much larger scale than what we ever dreamed of, really, quite frankly. So in clinical trials, people can access stem cells that are defined as drugs, meaning that they've been processed. Okay, they're not like same-day treatment. So to take a step back, if you were to get a stem cell product that is quote-unquote not processed, it was once thought that, not processed means cells that have come out of the body and maybe been spun down to get rid of the gunk and then put back in, right? Scientific terms. That process would be not a drug production process and therefore fall under the HCTP regulation. But FDA has since, and through some major lawsuits, has kept their footing on, even if you do a same-day procedure, if there is some degree of separation going on, so you're separating or purifying the cells in any way, we're going to define this as a drug manufacturing process. So it's going to not fall under HCTP, okay? It's going to frustrate all the people who say, these are my cells from my body. Why are they drugs? Again, it's the processing part that puts them into that bucket. And so all this to say, yes, FDA has put their foot down on individual practices and companies that are doing this sort of promoting this sort of same-day treatment. It also goes hand in hand with how the products are marketed. So if a practitioner is advertising that such procedure will help your arthritis or will help your migraine go away, then those are claims, and those are drug claims. You notice that when you buy a bottle of vitamins, they're not allowed to make any claim. They can't tell you that vitamin C is going to get rid of your cold. They're not allowed to make any kind of claims whatsoever, because the minute that you do, you would become a drug. Yeah. So those are some dividing lines. And I would imagine that doctors would have a very difficult time trying to convince someone to pay thousands of dollars for a stem cell treatment without making a claim, right? There has to be some clinical benefit, medical benefit to the patient. So by sharing this sort of information, claims are being made, and those are sort of the reasons why or how FDA is regulating all of this. Yeah. So it's illegal. Are stem cells illegal? Yes, many stem cell processes are illegal, but probably the right ones are illegal. Now, the ones that are following the regulatory pathways, it's not that they are illegal to access. They are definitely more difficult to access because they have to be accessed in a regulated program, whether it be a clinical trial or a expanded access program, which is another FDA program, or Right to Try, which is also regulated by FDA, but sort of in a different way. It's not really regulated. They oversee it, that program. So it has to be within one of these buckets. Yeah, that's the answer.
It's a great answer. All right, so we're starting to talk about a lot of stuff that vitally impacts and shapes how we do what we do and answers, the questions people ask when they come in the door in a very brass tacks way. But if we return to that original question, what do you think of this tweet? If we're still calling it a tweet, we don't really know. What do you think of this, And again, it says, FDA's war on public health is about to end. This includes its aggressive suppression of, long list, including stem cells. When I read that and when I think about the history, I continue to be impressed by how young, relatively speaking, everything that we're doing is. And when you start talking about how legislation and regulation have changed and continue to change and evolve, we've only talked about 70s through now. That's just not a lot of time. So I read a tweet like this and I think, okay, we're still looking and scrutinizing cell therapy, access to cell therapy, and all these other mechanisms, which I believe is right and good. So does it change things?
So I think the bottom line is that things have to change. Okay, I maybe not to the extreme that is said in that tweet. I think But there is room for change. And one of the biggest reasons for this is because technology and biotechnology specifically is moving at a faster pace than our regulatory framework. So if our framework was developed in the late 90s and hasn't been really rewritten or reevaluated, just more rules on top of that regulation, we have a problem because we're trying to define, at least what we do, stem cells into a particular category in which that category may not be a good fit. Yeah. And so there's that part of it. And I think knowing that we are moving fast and technology is moving fast, if there is a way that our legal framework regulatory framework can move with that speed, maybe taking into account more of what industry's experience has been, is going to be vital. I mean, there are aspects to all of this that must change. For instance, and these are very obvious things, like for instance, if someone develops a cell therapy for, let's say, some neurological condition, okay, and the cells that we use, we know that they do fundamentally, like they can lower neuroinflammation, as an example. Well, almost every brain condition has neuroinflammation, okay? And the way drugs are regulated today is your drug can only be approved for a very specific condition. It can't be a blanket approval. There isn't any such thing of that, right? So what happens is, once you get approval for a specific indication, if you want to do a different indication, you have to go through clinical trials and that whole pathway. Again, $1 billion is the estimate right now to get through that approval process. So by doing this way, number one, your drug cost is going to go incredibly high because the drug companies are going to have to recoup the cost that it takes to develop these products. And then it's going to take that much longer too, right? That's also time to market is another issue. But are we adding more safety parameters by doing this? So that now you have a specific label that this is good for, this drug is specifically for Parkinson's, or this drug is... See, in cells, I think if you go back to what they do mechanistically, then we can really make advances in sort of understanding what they do at a fundamental level, which would mean that they can impact many diseases or many classes of diseases. And so then now you suddenly have literally expanded access across many different conditions in a much quicker time frame, but safely, right? So still doing all those things. So that's sort of a logical, I think, much more logical approach than sort of the way we're doing things right now. Because I understand why we do things in the drug world in these specific ways. And it's because a drug, by definition, is a chemical. And a chemical pathway is a single pathway. Therefore, that single pathway in that disease is going to be affected, which is why you have to do it that way. Like, there's no other mechanism of action. But when you have a cellular product that can do many, many different things that could benefit a whole class of conditions, then I think we have to evaluate first and foremost safety, but then kind of work on those back end things. And that's just sort of my off the cuff thoughts on ways that I hope that new regulations will take form and we will make progress faster. Yeah. In the highest quality way.
Couldn't agree more. And today we've spent our time talking about how we think about stem cells as a country, a little bit as a company, as an industry, just what is the landscape? And we did so as an effort to try to answer this question that we get a lot, why are stem cells illegal? And we've even talked about that question and why in some ways that's not the most precise question. So next time, which I'm committing us to next time since we don't have a gala this month, let's talk a little bit more specifically about adult cell therapy, about the type of work that we do here and how it impacts the people we meet, and continue this in a more specific way. Does that work for you?
Yep. Sounds
awesome.
good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you then.
Bye.